Again. Thank you. That's great.
Sorry, I couldn't get the drop-down thing to pop up so that I could turn my mic on. All right. So just like in the forest case, we're doing the same sorts of things, but because we're in coral and mangrove protections, the controls, of course, are a little bit different, right? So we're looking at distance from the shore, distance from the continental shelf, distance from coral and mangrove edges, so the edge of the patch, distance from settlement areas. But the logic is the same, right? So we're doing exactly the same process, except in this case, the outcome is the destruction of a patch of coral or a patch of mangrove. And so here again, this is enabled by just absolutely heroic efforts on Kelvin's part as he was going out on boats, sampling sites, determining whether or not there was evidence of dynamite destruction, sampling mangrove sites, and then doing all the machine learning again, which, as challenging as it is to train an algorithm to identify forest versus non-forest, you can imagine how much even more challenging it is to do that for coral. But he did it, and these are the modeling results using more or less the same approach as we did for forest. There actually was surprisingly very, very little mangrove lost during the study period. And so if you look at our model results here, there's essentially almost 100% survival is estimated. There is some evidence that the marine protected areas are doing a little better in survival than the beach management units. So here we have a slight difference between the two. So here we actually have the simpler area outperforming the more complex one. But again, the survival rates in this case are so high that I would sort of take this with a grain of salt. The coral survival probability tells us a much more interesting story. And here, one of the interesting things that's going on, of course, is one, there's more coral that's being lost, right? So we actually have a little bit more variation to think about here. And so in the case of coral, we do find that the marine protected area is actually doing a better job than the beach management units, the more complex governance. And of course, I'll defer to the folks that are in the coastal case, but my understanding is that part of this is, just that these things are more squarely within the marine protected area's remit than they are for the beach management units. The other thing that's really interesting is, once again, we find this inverse relationship with network complexity, right? So it seems that network complexity is associated with higher survival rates for mangroves and lower survival rates for coral. And again, this is an area that I think we've got a lot more work to dig into. I haven't been able to work on this one as much as we have on the forestry case. I suspect this also has to do with the composition of the network, but I will say that I'm still puzzled at this. So to sort of summarize the results, it generally does seem to be the case that more complex governance tends to perform as well as or better than simpler governance regimes in protecting forests. Right, so that's good news. That means that these more community-based approaches are at least doing as well as the state-based approaches. However, simpler governance outperforms more complex governance in the marine and coastal case. But again, we think there are probably sort of specific reasons for that. And finally, network complexity has all of these inconsistent relationships with resource protection, and our further sort of digging into this seems to suggest that it really does depend on the organization types that are composing that network. And so thank you all very much. I hope I didn't have my timer on, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Caleb. We worked on this for years. This is very, very complex and sophisticated analysis. We've been trying to boil down the message as much as we can. It's still probably fairly technical, but because of this part of the discussion is more on the scientific part, and because of the help that we hope to get also from our discussants, I think we also chose to really show you how much work went behind that, and especially from Caleb, who spent an enormous amount of time in the field calibrating these images and going on boats and finding different patches of coral.
Kelvin.
Caleb, Kelvin. Yeah, the names are too close. Sorry. Caleb was the modeler in chief, but the two of them worked really fantastically together with the rest of the team, of course. Kelvin, of course. A little parenthesis, as I had suspected, we communicated with Beatrice, who thought it was 9 o'clock in Sweden that she had to come in, as opposed to Dar es Salaam. Unfortunately, she had to go back to her meeting where she was hiding from to help us out. But because her feedback is very much methodological and very geeky, very technical, she told me that she would send us her feedback in writing, so we will benefit from that, but we will not hear from her in this session. So at this point, I would like to move on and hear from our two discussants. So Kathy Homewood first, and then Esteve Corbera. Kathy?
Well, hello, and first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this discussion and conference. It's a real privilege to be involved. And I'd like to say the overall research question, what sorts of governance and partnerships make for better environmental and social outcomes, is just of huge importance and of real interest to me. So thank you for involving me. I'm afraid I haven't attended previous sessions, so I've just had the opportunity to read bits of the edited volume, especially the introduction and chapter 9, and then to hear Caleb's presentation just now. So forgive me if I bring up things that have been discussed in some detail already. First of all, I just want to congratulate you all on your work. I mean, clearly, you guys have gathered and managed a huge amount of remotely sensed and other data. I personally like the term remotely sensible, which has entertaining connotations in English. But clearly, you have brought incredibly sophisticated technical skills to this and to the analysis, and your results are really intriguing. So I've had to work quite hard to get my head around what your categories mean. So if I can just repeat to make sure that I've got it right, my understanding of the term that you use, institutional complexity, is that more complex governance is seen as co-management, essentially, WMAs, VLFRs, and simple governance is seen as top-down, national forest reserves, game reserves, and so on. And from the results you've just outlined, more complex governance performs as well or better than simpler governance in protecting forests, but simpler governance outperforms more complex governance in marine and coastal protection, as I understand it. And there are some paradoxes around areas of disputed tenure and so on. So looking at those results, and in particular reading the chapter, your chapter 9, I came up with a couple of questions. And forgive me if these questions are naive, but the first of all, with institutional complexity, to what extent might your findings be shaped by type and degree of enforcement? And the reason I ask this is that my experience of WMAs in northern Tanzania is that they are extremely strongly enforced, which may not be the case in southern, southeastern. But that means that simple cases like forest reserves, simple governance cases like forest reserves and game reserves may perhaps be less strongly enforced. And the converse might apply with beach management units versus marine protected areas. So I just wondered whether someone would comment on the degree and type of enforcement in those different sorts of governance institutional complexity. It really harks back to Ruth's comments earlier. My second question is around network complexity, which, as you've shown us, gives these sort of mixed and divergent outcomes. So you've got inconsistent relationships with resource protection, and I completely see that your conclusion that it's to do with the type and quality of interactions within the networks, which is what counts. It's not just complexity as captured by your indices. So, for example, in Lindy, you've got the timber entrepreneurs, if you like, and in Poine, you've got tourism, and those make for very different patterns within the networks. So, building on that, and in a way, this also builds on Dan's earlier question or challenge. Have you envisaged constructing and using a different type of index of net to capture network? So what would that index involve ideally if you were to apply a different sort of network quality, if you like, network complexity quality index? And my final question is probably not entirely fair because it's something that's not covered in today's presentation, but it is something that's covered in your chapter 9, and it really interested me. This is that local people's perceptions of environmental outcomes diverges from the remotely sensed findings. Now, it may be that you've discussed this in detail in previous sessions, and if so, my apologies. But I wanted to ask the presenters and also perhaps the wider group here today, if local perceptions of environment diverge from remotely sensed findings, if they come out with different patterns of what's seen as better or worse from what is predicted by remote sensing, what do you see as the likely reason for that? And I'd like to offer up some reasons, and maybe you could say whether or not they apply. So my third question is, to what extent do you think that divergence between local perceptions and remotely sensed outcomes, to what extent do you think that divergence is due to one or more of the following? First of all, are local people making strategic answers because they think a particular answer may give them some advantage in future interactions, either with your research group or with management? Secondly, are local people making guarded answers because they fear the potential consequences of those answers? Thirdly, is it just that your proportional differences that you show are large, but the absolute differences that you show are actually quite small? Are local people just not picking up the quantitatively small changes involved? Or finally, and this is the one that really interests me if it's the case, is it that local people's evaluation of resource quality is based on certain qualitative dimensions that are just not captured and not capturable by remotely sensed data? I think I've had my 7.5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really fantastic questions, very sharp and short. Esteve, your turn now.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Kathy, for these inspirational questions. I think they complement very well what I'm just going to say. I also want to start with words of congratulations and thanks. Amazing work. I'm just so jealous of the Nexus project. And as I said to Dan yesterday, I haven't been in such an exciting project involved in recent years. So it's really nice to see that these big partnership projects can produce so exciting findings. So congratulations. So now focusing on the chapter of this session, I just have some methodological and analytical questions or comments. So first, I would start with the methodological ones. I'm not going to go into the sort of complexity behind the statistical methods and the remote sensing data, but let me ask you some questions. I had to read chapter 3 to understand some of the bits from chapter 9. And so my first question is, there is a piece of information in chapter 3 that doesn't appear in chapter 9, and which I think is very important to be able to interpret your findings, which has to do with the above ground biomass threshold that comes from early work by McNichol. You choose a 10 tons of carbon per hectare threshold to actually classify forests from non-forest and to identify degradation and afforestation patterns. So the related question is whether you consider doing any sensitivity analysis around this threshold to have a better sense of your findings and to see whether that threshold would affect your results considerably. That would be my first question. My second methodological question is a bit maybe too specific, so the audience, I hope they bear with me, is what did you do with bordering pixels, yeah? So I've done these matching assessments myself, and one of the challenges is to make a methodological decision of what happens to pixels that fall across, let's say, your treatment versus your non-treatment area. So your like village boundaries or your governance arrangement boundaries and the control areas or the non-governed areas. So in this case, how did you decide about these sort of cross-boundary pixels? If you could give us again some detail on how you process that. Another methodological question, or more sort of interpretative question, is whether you could explain if there is a ceiling to concordance values. So what does it really mean to have a concordance value of 1.2 or 1.4, and up to which point you can get? So you say that higher concordance values improve, mean better forest, it means more forest conservation, so less forest loss. Is there a ceiling for that relationship? So if you could tell me a little bit more. And then, again, a couple of more sort of methodological questions. The first one has to do with figure 9.7, in which the title, you show, I just don't have it in front of me. Sorry about this, and sorry about the conciseness. But you talk about the estimated effects of institutional and network complexity on the odds a pixel is deforested. I wanted to understand if this means those pixels that over the study period move from above 10 tons of carbon per hectare to below, yeah? Or you are also including degradation pixels, yeah? So those that see the state of forest sort of going worse, but not necessarily beyond the 10 tons of carbon per hectare threshold. And I say this because, again, along the same lines of the sensitivity question, is whether you studied, you looked at your results through the lens of degradation, or you only focused on deforestation, and if so, whether that's an analysis that you would like to pursue. Okay, and my final methodological question has to do with this issue that it's really the elephant in the room for this chapter, which is this relationship between institutional and network complexity. So again, I wonder whether you could give us more information on how you made the attribution of the network complexity index or the institutional complexity to space. I mean, how did you spatially attribute these variables? Because I understand, or my understanding was that institutional complexity is basically attributed according to probably village boundaries. So every village is allocated a certain level of institutional complexity if it is located within the boundaries of a certain governance arrangement. But how did you do this with network complexity when precisely one of the things you are sort of telling us is that there are some actors in a specific network, which are these private actors that you think are having a specific influence on environmental outcomes. So these actors are de facto also operating outside, let's say, your your studied networks. Yeah, so they may also have an influence on control areas, because these are private actors who may also have a relationship with irrigation or with other activities. So how you then attribute these variables spatially? Well, I hope I made myself clear. I know it's a bit of a complex question. And then just finally, I promise I'm finishing. I would like to take advantage of this meeting and of this chapter in particular to get a little bit more information about the political economy of deforestation in Tanzania. Yeah? Because you clearly show in the maps that you talk about two arcs in the paper, but in fact, in the map, there seemed to be a third arc of deforestation that cuts across the country. And I would like you to tell us a little bit more about that, and also about the dynamics of forest conservation, because you also show us that there are millions and millions of hectares that have not changed, and to which extent those overlap with existing protected areas and conservation regimes. Yeah, so give us a little bit more about the political economy of deforestation and conservation, and your reflections in relation into your analysis and livelihoods as a whole, if you wish. Okay, I have more comments, but I'll keep them and put them in writing, because I think I'm going over time. So sorry, I look like a methodological freak, so I apologize if I bored some people. Thank you.
No need to apologize. Thank you very much, Esteve. Very much appreciated the very close reading of the book and the analysis. Also very nice to have you here for different sessions of the conference. I'm going to gather some questions from the room. We'll have time for one round, and then come back to the presenters for a combined reflection. Anybody from the room who would like to ask a question now, or I can also give you some time and I can go back to the group before we do that.
Stefano.
Yes?
Sorry to interrupt. Will I have the chance later to say something else, or I should shut up?
Yes, you will. Don't worry.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, we have a question back here.
Yeah, I think thanks for quite impressive presentation. I think one clarification I need, is it village livelihood or is it village land forest reserve? I think that should be either a mistake, or it's termed village livelihood forest reserves, which is something new. But the other one is related to the difference between degradation and deforestation, because getting historical degradation is a bit difficult, and I would assume the map is showing deforestation. That means there is a forest loss rather than degradation. So I think if that is made clear, it could make a lot of sense. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't see any hands for now. Yes, we do. Mette?
Just following some of our discussion from yesterday, where we talked about how these forest managed areas impact the rest of the forest. So did you do any analysis of how the likelihood of being deforested increases with being next to an area that's managed by either government or through community-based forest management, in order to get a picture of the sort of overall effect on deforestation in Tanzania? Yeah.
Thank you, Mette. Matthew Mabede?
Yeah, actually my questions, Charles and Mette have already talked about my questions, but maybe I just wanted to add some. I think when Charles was asking a question, I think you wondered what was he talking about. But there's a table on forest protection results, and I think it's just a mistake. Instead of writing village land forest reserve, it's written village livelihood forest reserve. It's just a table. I think it's a mistake. And also on the deforestation degradation, I think it's on the map that shows the forest, the first map, I think, it's because these are two different terms, and on the map it's shown as one. So maybe I think if it's possible, I don't know if it's possible, if that could be differentiated, because these are two different terms. And then the last question, which also somewhat relates to matters, it's is it possible to illustrate the relationship between network complexity with forest survival as per different levels of partnership complexity? Because I think in the slide it shows like a generic sort of result. So I'm just wondering if that's possible, because that could be quite wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you both also for alerting us to possible errors. That, of course, we're still working to finalize this, so this is extremely helpful for us. I think at this point I would like to go back to the presenters, and chiefly to start with Caleb, and then maybe anybody else who wants to comment on all these good comments and questions. Caleb?
Thanks very much for all of these. These are really helpful. And yeah, I apologize about the Village Livelihood Forest Reserve. That's definitely my fault, because that came in when I was writing the code, so to generate the plots, and it's just a typo that then cascaded through all of the plots. So that is totally on me, not any of the Nepsis folks. They would not have made that mistake. To very quickly, some of the highlights. One thing that I think would clarify a lot of things is that we aren't actually modeling the degradation data in the study cases. So we have two different sets of satellite data. So the degradation data that Kelvin put together while at Edinburgh is at about a 30-meter resolution, and so we use that to sort of look qualitatively at the entire country and also do some sort of comparisons between the study areas as a whole versus the rest of the country. And so those threshold issues are there. That's actually part of the reason why we didn't distinguish deforested and degraded by color in the maps, is to sort of allow for the fact that you could set that threshold differently. Same for afforested, reforested. So those are at a 30-meter resolution. Kelvin actually made a separate set of data at a 10-meter resolution, where the forest is just present or absent, right? So that is just straight deforestation, not taking into consideration the biomass. But we are pretty interested in trying to see if we can use some of that biomass data to do some models in the future to actually look at forest change in a more continuous sort of scale. So I think that might clear up several of the things. I think the point about enforcement is a really helpful note here, and I think that could generate a lot of the differences in relative comparisons. And just a quick note of that, we do see differences in effectiveness of, for example, national forest reserves, even across Rufiji versus Kilwa, which does suggest that something like that might be going on. Interest in a different, the network quality measurement index. I think actually the problem is using an index in the first place. I think that the index is, ironically, we're trying to measure network complexity, and so we've created a simple index, and instead we should be disaggregating that index into multiple dimensions. And that's stuff that we've been working on and found, I think, a lot more sort of success with, that we don't find counterintuitive findings when we start disaggregating the characteristics of the network. Reasons that perception diverged from what we see with remote sensing. I'm going to leave that up to folks that have worked on the ground. I have some guesses that of all the things that you suggested, the answer is yes, 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 yes. The one thing I would say are the proportional differences versus the absolute differences. The absolute differences are between the areas are still quite large, but the thing is that we're identifying them, sort of controlling for the fact that there are protected areas and things like that, and I'm not quite sure that would be visible on the ground. I think hopefully what I said about the two different remote sensing data sets addresses several of Esteve's comments. Oh, and then the one quick thing on concordance values. So concordance values, they do have a ceiling of 1, but they're not a measure. They're not measuring deforestation. They're measuring model fit. So basically, what we're just showing with that is how much of the variance in deforestation different variables are explaining. And so that's not necessarily showing survival rates, that's just showing how good the model is getting at prediction. I think that's probably all the things that I feel even remotely qualified to give an answer on. So I'm going to I'm going to point the finger at Dan and make it his problem now.
Thank you.
But
thank you
thank
so
you,
much.
everybody. This is super helpful.
Thanks, Caleb. And some of these questions will relate to Kelvin, who's the one who really knows the situation, especially the technicality on the grounds. But I have Dan now, and in the meanwhile, I'm asking Lasse whether later on he wants to take some of the more, there was one question that was about social networks vis-a-vis something else. If not, just let me know. Okay, Dan?
Thank you. Well, I'd like to bounce some of these questions on to Ruth and Pili, actually, because I think Kathy's question as to the degree of enforcement in wildlife management areas as compared to just a straightforward national game reserve or forest reserve is different. And I don't know, and I wondered if Ruth and Pili do have any insights as to which of these, in the case of wildlife, which is more strongly protected. And Pili nakusema usiondoke bwana tunakutaji. We've got a question for you just now. Samani kidogo. But for Ruth, which is more strongly protected? A game reserve, a wildlife game reserve, or a wildlife management area? And for Pili, which is more strongly protected in your study area, the national forest reserves or the village forest reserves?
For the case of the forest, I can say that the village land forest reserve is more protected. Yeah, and they have the no harvest zone, where local communities or the village are not allowed to harvest from that in the village land forest reserve. So I can consider that it is more protected as compared to the other type of forest.
And is that protection more strongly enforced as well? Is it more strongly enforced?
Yeah, because even the harvesting process is done under the control of the Village Natural Resource Committee as compared to what is happening in a forest under the state control, where the buyers go there with their own harvesters, so they just harvest it. They can select kind of the tree that they want to harvest, but there's a limit. There's a limitation in CBFM villages on kind of the forest to be harvested. And the types, there are some forests that there are some types of forest species which are still under the control. For instance, Pingo, and those forests which are considered to be more endangered. So in the national forest reserves, sometimes it happens people just go there and harvest any kind of tree that they want to, based on the market.
Thank you, Dan. The game reserve is more protected because strictly no human activities is allowed in the game reserve. It's like 100 protected. Also in wildlife management areas is also protected. but the one which is protected the most is the game reserves and then wildlife management areas, where also human activities are not allowed.
And where are there most guards? Are there more guards in the wildlife management areas? Is there more policing in the wildlife management areas or the game reserves?
The game reserve, yes. Because the wildlife management areas are protected by the village game scouts, and sometimes there is patrols from these game rangers. Yes.
Thank you very much, Dan.
Just to add, in a forest, there are different kinds of forest reserve, and there are some forests which are still under the strict control of the state. So I can also consider those to be under protection as compared to the forest where people can go and harvest. So call it, if it is a general land, open land. Yeah. So there are some which are still under the strictly control of the state, that no human activities are allowed to be there.
Okay, we have 4 minutes until we need to finish this session. We have already eaten up half an hour on the coffee break, which we will squeeze. We have 2 questions. We have a question from the floor here, and then a question from Esteve.
Thank you. Mine was more of a comment rather than a question, and just to add briefly to the enforcement discussion, but in the context of the coastal zone. The beach management units do have a subcommittee, the Monitoring, Control and Surveillance Committee, who have the mandate for patrolling. But what we've seen in many BMUs is that those patrols are largely restricted to foot patrols on beaches because of lack of resources to fund at-sea patrols with fuel and boats. But where the village government is supportive of the BMU, often the village council will provide funds to purchase fuel. So those BMUs that have a good relationship with their village council are much more likely to be doing at-sea patrols. And comparing that to, say, the marine park that might have a separate budget for at-sea patrols. So I wonder whether that kind of enforcement effort was sort of captured in the data in the coastal zone that might help to explain some of those results.
Thank you very much. I think Faraja should give us an insight on that, because she spent a lot of time in BMUs and in the park, and yesterday unfortunately she couldn't be with us. So maybe could you add a little bit more? I mean, I recognize some of what she's saying, but I also know that there are some special situations in our area, and you have a very, very, very deep insights in the area. So Faraja?
Yeah, thank you, Prof. Yeah, what you have said is true, that the BMU, they are limited with resources to do the enforcement activities, and the patrol they are doing just on the beaches, and they are not going to the deep sea and whatever. And when they go for patrol, sometimes if they don't involve these village leaders, they get into conflict. And we heard some story from one village whereby these BMU committee members went for patrol without involving the village leaders, and they were injured by the local community, the fisher. And when they reported to the village leaders, they didn't get any support from the leaders. They were told that, why did you go for patrol without informing us? So there was that kind of conflict between this BMU and the village leaders, that there is poor cooperation between, they don't get support from the village leaders, and therefore this hindered their effort to control, to protect the resource in their areas. And like from what the MREMP, they had the capacity to do the patrol in all whatever they want to do at the coastal areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Faraja. I'm going to go back to Esteve and then to Lasse very briefly. And Lasse, at the end, either you or Caleb, can you tell us about the 2 articles that you're working on, one on the social network, the other one on this actual work? I mean, this stuff is flying high now, so we want to also tell you how good this stuff is, and maybe you can plug in some information about what we're doing in terms of publications outside of the book, where this stuff is going. Thank you. Esteve?
Okay, this is great, because one of the points I was going to make, Stefano, which I didn't mention in my intervention, is that one of the things that chapter 9 is lacking, but of course you're probably working on this for the paper, is sort of in the introduction, which kind of academic debates the paper is contributing to. Is it, to sort of debates about how public policies or governance arrangements affect conservation outcomes? Is it debates about how tenure regimes affect conservation outcomes and so on? And obviously, the chapter is still underdeveloped in that sense. I want to pick up very quickly on two threads. One is this one about enforcement, about type of governance arrangement. I think you have a great data set there. I don't know if you've already done this, but nationwide, looking, even if it's not doing any kind of control and matching analysis, but just simply some overview of whether deforestation and degradation seem to be more observed in national parks versus wildlife management areas versus game reserves, etc. I mean, I wondered whether you've done this analysis, because obviously it's very, very interesting, and it's something that you could do. So moving beyond your case study sites to cover the whole country, that would be my first. And then the other one, which I forgot, is about perceptions and building on Professor Homewood's comments. One of the things I saw in the chapter is that there seems to be a rather even perception of resource conservation status in simpler institutional arrangements. And I wonder whether this would simply be, therefore probably different perceptions as well. So you kind of don't develop this in the chapter, and I wonder whether this is already something you are developing in the papers, and thank you again.
Thank you very much. Lasse?
Yeah, just to briefly respond to some of the network questions, Caleb already commented on the on the question about the network index, which is which, as we have said, is way too aggregated and lumps together too many different things. And so in the papers that Stefano just talked about, which is a couple of papers we're working on, we are working with much more disaggregated network variables. So in particular, we're looking at the density of private sector organizations, and following from our discussions today, I think a really important story is the nature of those organizations and their interests. And then the other variable is the density of civil society organizations involved at the local level. So there was also a question on the conditional impact of network structure within different complexity regimes, and this is something that we really would like to develop, but we have been challenged simply by the number of study sites, because the network variables, they only vary across villages. They don't vary across land plots. So we have limited variation there, unfortunately, to include interaction terms between the different types of protected areas and the types of networks involved. So that's unfortunate, but something we would have loved to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Caleb, you want to close and also tell us where this thing is going? And I would really like to invite all the people who are present here to understand that we're really scratching the surface here. We have a lot of data, and there's been a lot of work done, but there's a lot more that can be done. And your ideas are not just ideas for us to run with it, but we want to share this data, and we want to share the work with whoever wants to come in. It's not that it's just, oh, this is NEPSUS, we're just going to do it. We see our work in this field as a start of a journey, not the end of it.
I would definitely second that, and also again, thank you all for the really helpful comments. I mean, I think that there's it's helping me to think about things on the modeling side that I hadn't thought of yet. And I think part of it is, we've sort of been driving through to make sure the book is done. And now we've got a little bit of headspace and bandwidth to kind of open back out again. And I do think there's a lot of interesting possibilities. Looking at nationwide analysis, going back to those perceptions, which I think somebody in my bench tends to see something like that and say measurement error and go on. But I think there's probably more to delve into there. As far as what we're doing right now, Lasse has sort of led the group. We've got an article coming out, well, minor revisions should be coming out soon, hopefully, from social networks, where we're doing some of the preliminary work here, actually without matching, just looking at the VLFRs in Kilwa before and after, and looking at disaggregating that network variable, so that we can sort of see the differences between civil society, private sector, and then like characteristics of the structure of the network. And we find some really interesting things there that help explain some of the weirdness that we encounter in the chapter. And then we're just about finished up with the manuscript that we're hoping to try for PNAS, with where we're doing that disaggregated network analysis for both Kilwa and Rufiji, so both of the forest and the wildlife cases. And that allows us to, again, sort of resolve a lot of these puzzling situations. And then I think, yeah, though, one of the things that we are sort of trying to come up with a strategy on is how to get a little bit more fine-grained temporal resolution so that we might be able to get some more leverage on those interactions between networks and institutions. But then I will also say that the idea of sort of running some sort of analysis for the whole country with the data that Kelvin has put together with deforestation and degradation sounds very appealing to me now. But I am also have a tendency to be a bit of a kid in a candy store when I have lots of data sets to play around with. So yeah, I think that's kind of where we are at this point.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks again for the presenters, and thanks to the discussant, Kathy and Esteve. I think we're gonna take a break now, and we will come back at the hour. I won't say what time because then we get confused. So in about 22 minutes, we're going to step out here. Unfortunately, for those of you who are elsewhere, it's actually quite nice out here, but we'll think about you. I'm so sorry. Anyway, most of these people are friends, so all of them, as a matter of fact. So thank you.
We are waiting to hear about the dancing last night. So you skipped the best part of the best part of the workshop, and you are not briefing us about it. That's really bad.
Hey, this is as far as we can get with the hybrid thing. I mean, I think it's quite amazing the way that the guys here are running the hybrid. But you know, we haven't gone into that sort of virtual reality thing where we can also socialize and have the same feeling there. So anyway, thank you very much. We'll be online anyway during this time, and those of you who want to stay with us, please do. And otherwise, thank you very much and goodbye.